Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture with Professor Karla Goldman, who will be discussing Jewish Cincinnati during the first years of Rabbi Joshua Haberman's life in the United States. As we were discussing ways to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Institute and honor Rabbi Haberman's legacy, we decided to have a two-part series exploring Jewish life in two cities that had a major impact on Rabbi Haberman's life and the Jewish community at large. Last October, Professor Marcia Rosenblit discussed the city of Rabbi Haberman's youth, Vienna, a recording of which is on our website if anyone wants to check it out. And tonight we will explore the next step in Rabbi Haberman's journey, Cincinnati. Many of you in general in our Jewish community probably don't think of Cincinnati when naming cities with a prominent Jewish history. But I imagine after this lecture, we'll all come to learn the very central role that Cincinnati played and continues to play in American Jewish life. And I look forward to learning with you all. I want to thank Edie and Art Hessel for sponsoring this program, and also to thank Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our spring 2024 lecture series. He dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman, Stephen C. Ammerman, and Avi West. I now welcome Art Hessel, the Haberman Institute Board Vice President, who will introduce our speaker. Welcome, Art.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. I am Art Hessel. I'm the Vice President of the Haberman Institute, and I'm honored to introduce this talk, one which is uniquely connected to our 40th anniversary and honors the legacy of our founder, Rabbi Joshua Haberman. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of those who are new to the Haberman Institute, which was founded by Rabbi Haberman 40 years ago. Our mission hasn't changed. It's to provide quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, Jewish history, Jewish culture. We invite you to learn more about the Haberman Institute programs and classes by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org. Our next lecture will be Rabbi Bradley Artson of the Ziegler School for Rabbinic Studies. He will be speaking on science and religion, reviving an ancient partnership. Following that, among other things, we have 3 programs on music coming up, one on piano music, one on dance, and one on opera. And we have multi-session classes starting on the biblical characters Elijah and Jonah and Ruth. And if you go to our website, you can see or listen to over 200 other programs. All of our lectures like this one are free. That is, they're free to you. They're not free to us. And the only way we can keep them coming is through your generous support. We invite you to contribute, to become a friend of the Haberman Institute, to sponsor a lecture. How to do this? You'll find that out on our website. You'll find it out in our various communications, and we thank you in advance. And now to this evening. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Karla Goldman's research focuses on the history of the American Jewish experience, with special attention to the history of American Jewish communities and the evolving roles and contributions of Jewish women. She directs the University of Michigan Jewish Communal Leadership Program, which is a collaborative effort between the School of Social Work and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies. She has taught at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. She's been the historian in residence at the Jewish Women's Archive in Brookline, Massachusetts. And she's the author of Beyond the Synagogue Gallery, Finding a Place for Women in American Judaism. We've had a number of programs, as Matt mentioned, over the years, focusing on specific Jewish communities, recently on the Jewish histories of Texas, Virginia, Maine, and the city of Madison, Wisconsin, and there will be more of these to come. Today's topic is Cincinnati, the Queen City of the Ohio River, one of the most important cities in the history of American Judaism. Cincinnati is the home of the Hebrew Union College. It was an important city in Rabbi Haberman's life. And what other city can pride itself on being the hometown of Steven Spielberg, Theda Bara, Jerry Rubin, Sarah Jessica Parker, Jerry Springer, and Square Matzes? Now, to be truthful, I don't know if Dr. Goldman is going to mention any of those things, but I thought I would sneak it in because you should know that. I now turn the program over to you, Dr. Goldman, and I will sit back and see what else Cincinnati has to offer.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Art. Let me, when I spoke to Matt about possibility of doing this talk, I noticed that there had been a number that had focused on cities. And I noticed that Rabbi Haberman's memoir focused on cities. Let me just grab my PowerPoint here. Take a minute to get it started. And I noticed that in his title, he only mentioned 3 cities in the making of, in the making of a rabbi. But and I thought it was a wonderful memoir as a way to sort of begin to learn about his life. And I didn't, like many of you, have the opportunity to know him. But he really, he covers a lot of geography in his life, especially in the United States, but only mentions 3 that I guess are sort of the highlight points for him. But when he left Austria and came to the United States in 1938, he landed in Cincinnati. And so his first encounter with America, with American Judaism, with Reform Judaism, all happened in Cincinnati. And as Art just suggested, Cincinnati had a very particular history. There was a reason why he came to Cincinnati, and we'll try and get at that a little bit. As I begin, and I'll mention one thing, Art. One thing that I bet you wouldn't think is that Steven Spielberg's father would show up in the same article as Rabbi Haberman. So there was something like, social notes, and there was one thing about Irving Spielberg winning an award for engineers, and then later something about Josh Haberman sort of writing a Haggadah play. So all the same thing. So yes, I will mention Spielberg, but so not all of those other things. But it was, as you suggest, a very rich place and an interesting place to become an American during World War II. So, of course, his story starts not in Cincinnati, it starts in Vienna. And of the people who came to refugees, who came to study to become rabbis at Cincinnati's Hebrew Union College. And that's, by the way, the building in the middle, the sort of bird's eye view there is a model of the Hebrew Union College campus as it was when Rabbi Haberman arrived there, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. He was the one, there were 8 students overall coming from German-speaking lands. 7 of them came from Germany. 1, Haberman, came from Austria. He was the one who has shared sort of, I thought, the most compelling narrative about why in the mid-1930s, in a city with Nazi youth marching through it, anti-Semitism on the rise, a really sort of compelling narrative about why he wanted to become a rabbi. And he said he went to his parents and he said, I'm thinking I want to go study to become a rabbi. And they said, what is the matter with you? As he wrote, it's like, are you sick? How could you possibly want to do this? And, in 1936, seeing what was happening in Germany, very close to Austria, And in part, what he was saying, he talked about sort of kind of the bloodthirsty songs that of wanting to kill Jews that sort of young Viennese youth were singing, marching through the streets. It's that it made him wonder about this tradition, to see the kind of animus toward it and know that this wasn't the first time that that had happened. And he writes, a rabbinical career in Austria at that time, I had to admit, it was absurd. Why study to be a rabbi? And he went on to say that, you know, he had few influences. One, that he had an uncle who was a great student of Judaism, who shared that with him, who was so excited about it. So that was very compelling to him. But also seeing the fierce anti-Semitism in Vienna never let me forget that I was a Jew. And it was a daily experience of anti-Semitism. And I did take the opportunity to listen to the sermons or the talks, actually, by Rabbi Haberman on the Washington Hebrew website. And there was just one question someone asked him about Vienna. And he said, "Oh, it's a beautiful city." He said, "And the people are terrible." You know, saying this many years later, obviously, but that memory of his youth, where he said it was a daily experience, the slurs and the jokes in his schools and on the streets, obviously left a mark. And as he was thinking about taking on this career, he said he devoured Jewish history to discover what it was that made my people persevere as a persecuted minority for 2,000 years in the diaspora. Why would Jews hold on to their Judaism? What was there in Judaism that made so many generations of Jews willing to suffer for its sake? I had a burning desire to know why Jews remain Jews through the ages. So I guess that was compelling enough for his parents that they made a deal with him. When you went to study to become a rabbi in Vienna, you also enrolled at the University of Vienna. You could take 5 years to become a rabbi and get a PhD, which is the time frame that they put on that. And then after that, you know, he would make a wise choice and go into his parents' business. Of course, 5 years from that date, his parents' business had been taken over by the Nazis, and there was no business to go into, and he himself was in Cincinnati. But they made that deal, so he enrolled both at the University of Vienna. This is in fall of 1937, and forgive my German pronunciation, the Israelitische Theologische Lehranstalt, which was the rabbinical seminary in Vienna, and began his studies. But that all came to an end in March 1938 with the Anschluss from the Nazi takeover of Austria. He was not allowed to study any longer at the university, and the Lehranstalt was not running classes at that point. He had already been for a number of years very determined to get out of Austria, even as his parents didn't seem to take the threat as seriously. So here he was going to be a student. His parents' business was being taken away. He said, I needed to learn some kind of skill to get myself that I could take to another country. He actually began to learn, develop photography and work on the skills of how to develop film for a photography studio. But really miracle of miracles, he was called in to the Lehranstalt by one of the professors to say, well, we have a letter here from Cincinnati, and they are offering 2 of our students the opportunity to go there on a full scholarship and study to become a rabbi in America. And he said to him, and I'm asking you, not because we think you're the best student, but because you're the youngest, and you probably have the best shot of taking advantage of this opportunity and adjusting to America and becoming an American rabbi. And he, so desperate to get out of Austria, really leaped at the chance. They had been filing applications for visas. And this is an interesting thing, because I think probably a lot of us know the story about that it was really hard, all the stories that we read about the documentary about America and the Holocaust, how hard it was to get a visa to get out, right? To get all the things that you needed in place. But at this moment, and for student visas, and also we're going to talk about an earlier group from 1935, they really didn't have that much of a challenge. The invitation from HEC, Hebrew Union College, really accelerated the process. And so within really, I think it was about 3 weeks, a few months, he had a visa, and because they had applied earlier, his sister, he was 19, his sister was 17, they both had visas. His parents, who had actually been born in what was then Poland, and the Polish visa quota had been exhausted, so they were not going to be able to leave with him, but they told their children, yeah, it's time to go. And so they left in August 1938, took the boat to New York. They were greeted by some family members. His father had a stepsister there, who had kind of stayed with them for a few weeks. They had a house on Long Island, and that was how they entered America, and then took the train to Cincinnati. So he was not the first. He was actually the last of the 8 German-speaking students who came to Cincinnati to Hebrew Union College. But Hebrew Union College should be known and appreciated and famous for making an extreme effort to reach out for scholars, Jewish scholars threatened by the Nazis, and also for students. Here we see a little mixed group you can see my arrow on the left. These are students here, some of whom we'll talk about. This is Ernst Lorge. This is Jacob Plaut. This is Abraham Joshua Heschel, who most of you probably will be familiar with. And Abraham Joshua Heschel was one of the scholars that President Morgenstern of Hebrew Union College really fought and put in a tremendous amount of energy to identify scholars who were threatened by the Nazis, invite them to come, work to get them visas. Ultimately, they had about 8 who were on the faculty at HUC in Cincinnati, but they also managed to place a few other scholars at other institutions of Jewish learning and tried to have get the different schools, which were the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Jewish Institute of Religion, which was not a part of HUC at that time, and Dropsy College in Philadelphia, to cooperate in working together to try and bring these scholars out. In the end, it was mostly HEC that did the work. A few of the other schools took some of the faculty members that he found. But I said that the Lehrenstadt had invitation for 2 students. Ultimately, only Haberman went. But there was kind of a more famous group, a more well-known group that was invited to come to Hebrew Union College from the Hochschule für das, I'll get to it, for this Wissenschaft des Judentums, the Jewish Theological Institute in Berlin. 5 students came from there in the late summer, early fall, September 1935. And you see on the left here is an article about their arrival. You see the 5 of them. And then there were 3 others. Ernst Lorge came later. Oscar, as his name was then, Oscar Yehoshua Haberman. This is a picture of him in 1937 as he was enrolling at the University of Vienna. And then there was one other, Ted Weiner, who I couldn't find a picture of. But I'm going to talk a bit about the experience of that first group of 5, because I think it tells us a lot about what it was like to arrive from a Jewish theological experience, training to be a rabbi in Germany or in Austria, and land in Cincinnati, and landed at a particular place, Hebrew Union College, and what that was like for them. And sort of, I guess, in the end, maybe join me in marveling that they sort of managed to Americanize and become really, all of them, almost really sort of leading members of the American rabbinate, people who had a big influence on Reform Jewish practice in the United States. And many of them, like Rabbi Haberman, very long-lived, and so sort of become really elder statesmen and sort of the wise men of of the Reform movement of American Judaism and North American Judaism, as Gunter Plaut ended up in Toronto. So a number of this group, 3 of the 5, wrote memoirs, and spent some time sort of reflecting on what this meant. And in his memoir, Rabbi Plaut sort of talks about how he complained a lot about the college when he was there, and about the education, and about the professors, and how they didn't connect, and about how weird it all was, and how they didn't understand the experience of people like them coming from another world, desperately worried about the families and friends they had left behind, watching what was continuing to evolve and happen in Germany and in Austria. It is interesting, the fact that these young men got out. I think in each case, often because of them, all of their families managed to get out. So all of their close family members, so all of them, their parents and their siblings, it seems like, also got out before the extermination program went into effect. Some of their fathers were arrested in Kristallnacht, or before that. Rabbi Haberman's father actually was taken in just as he was getting the permission to leave, and his mother managed to get him out. But those were very, of course, devastating experiences. But this is one of sort of the recollections of Rabbi Plaut when he went back to speak at a Hebrew Union College ordination in 1970, and the significance of what it meant to be saved, really saved by Hebrew Union College. For us, it was life itself. And I cannot let this moment pass without saying thanks to all who had a hand in giving us life, to the giver of life, and to those who were his agents and who brought the green horn of 35 years ago to this moment to address this class of 1970, amongst whom his own son is found. So the level of appreciation for what was done by the college for many of these people, of course, remained very high in their mind throughout. You might know that Abraham Joshua Heschel ended up teaching at Jewish Theological Seminary, and that Hebrew Union College was not really congenial for a man of his sort of beliefs and practices, but he and his family, including his daughter, Susanna Heschel, have always expressed incredible appreciation to Hebrew Union College for taking them out of the fire. So they come to Hebrew Union College. On the left is a picture of the building where the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums was in Berlin. Now it's a Central Council of Jews in Germany. Looks pretty nice. Plaut, or one of his colleagues, described it as sort of a squalid neighborhood. And really what each of them sort of focused on, including Rabbi Haberman, was this incredible campus that they came to in Cincinnati. It sits on a hill. Rabbi Plaut writes about sort of looking out the back window. Art, can you see my cursor in there? If I point with that, do you see my cursor? Yeah. So this building here is a dormitory that they lived in. And all of these students came with full tuition, and also paying. This is a sisterhood dormitory. It was built by the Women of Reform Judaism, then National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, for the students of HUC. And the sisterhoods really provided each of these students with scholarships so that they could live there. We'll talk a little bit. They each did stuff to earn money. They lived on very, very little, but they felt they were in the lap of luxury. There was someone came and cleaned their room every day. They said, Plaut talked about this, about the college. He said, it appeared as a series of castles set in spacious grounds, reflecting the opulence of America and its self-indulgent. Gymnasium and swimming pool, and this was something that the faculty member in Vienna mentioned to Rabbi Haberman, future Rabbi Haberman. They have a swimming pool there, and it's sort of thought to be the only rabbinical school in the world with a swimming pool and a basketball court. And in that time, this area that I'm pointing to now is now where the library is, but these were actually tennis courts. And so this really just seemed like what incredible place. Every day their rooms were clean, their laundry was done, their linen was changed, and their dinner was served to them in the dining room. And they, if you think about what Germany was like in the mid-30s and what was happening to the economy there and what was crashing, and this was the middle of the Depression, both in the United States as well, they were sort of overwhelmed by suddenly getting to live this way. And the dorm rooms for them were also seemed very big. So they get here, but what was it like? What was that experience like? So they tell the story. They took the train. They landed in New York. They were a few days in New York. A few of them had family members there, and all of them stayed with those families. And they got on the train to Cincinnati. They landed on a Sunday. By Friday, they were in Cincinnati. They took a stop to get out and tour Washington, D.C. a little bit. But they arrived on what they were very impressed by in the center here, Union Terminal in Cincinnati. Its heyday was during World War II when so many American soldiers went through that terminal. But you can see this beautiful building that was just really built just around then. It was brand new, wonderful Art Deco style. It showed something about the solidity of the city and its vision. And for most of them, a city they had never heard of, a school they had never heard of. They were greeted by Dr. Nelson Glick, who later became the president of HUC. He was a very famous archaeologist. He was on Time magazine after World War II, but he was very well known. He took them to the parents of his wife. This is Dr. Helen Iglauer Glick. She was a noted radiologist, medical doctor. Again, she came from a very established German Jewish family in Cincinnati. Glick and Iglauer Glick, it was a mixed marriage because Nelson Glick actually came from a Russian Jewish family, but marrying into one of the very prominent German Jewish families in Cincinnati. Her father was a very prominent across the community doctor at both Jewish Hospital and the University of Cincinnati Hospital and Medical School. So Nelson takes them, picks them up, brings them to the Iglauer house, and they come out with breakfast because they've been traveling all night. And lo and behold, what do they serve? I don't have a picture of it, but it's bacon and eggs. And they are shocked, all right? This is like one of their first, they're shocked by America. Plout describes being shocked when he sees someone just like throw a newspaper on the floor of a subway car. It's like he couldn't believe that Americans would just throw out something that in Germany they used to wrap food, to store things as toilet paper or something that, in America, they just throw things away. So they're very shocked by that. But really now they've been welcomed by a faculty member of Hebrew Union College, and they've been served bacon and eggs. And they sort of said, well, no, we already ate. And then the Glicks and the Iglauers get the picture and they bring out some eggs without bacon. But this for them was what is going to be happening here in America. And we're going to go into that a little bit more, what this Judaism that they encountered looked like and felt like to them. In reading Rabbi Haberman's memoir, he talks about how when he came to Cincinnati into Hebrew Union College, remember he'd been a student in a German gymnasium, very good education in a German language high school. He'd had a semester and a bit at the University of Vienna and at the Lehrenstadt. Stalt, but so he brings and he says, and he went over to the University of Cincinnati and he got 2 years of college credit for his transcript, and he got 1 year off of his rabbinical studies. And usually the program here was what would happen with most of the students at that time is they would go to Cincinnati for both college and rabbinical school. So there was sort of a preparatory program in the rabbinical school as they completed their college degree. The course was often 8 years. You could also come with already having a BA, and it would be a 4-year rabbinical course. But so in this case, you're looking potentially at 8 years of study. So I was like, wow, that must show. I read that. I said, that must show that they really learned so much in both the gymnasium and that little bit of that, the German, Austrian education, Viennese education was much better than American education. But then in reading in one of his colleagues who was in the 1935 group, Wally Kelter, writes about how he brought his transcripts over from Germany and went over to the University of Cincinnati, which is across the street, a block up and across the street from Hebrew Union College, to see, what courses he should enroll in. And so he said, and also most of them spoke no English. So that's the other thing that's happening, right? They're coming over, they really only Gunter Plaut, they say, knew some English, and he says he didn't really know any English. So they thought he was great at it, but that was just compared to them. So also that's the other experience of just in a matter of months, it's like, do you want to go to America? Do you want to go to Cincinnati? And then, okay, get ready and go and try and learn some English on the boat. So he goes over with one of the American rabbinical students, and they say to him, okay, did you take comparative zoology? And he doesn't know what either of those are, but his friend, the other rabbinical student, says, just say you did. They said, oh, great, 4 credits for comparative zoology. They said, they looked at his math scores, and he said he was terrible in math. And there were different sort of categories. Genügend meant was sufficient, you were okay. His read nicht genügend. But the person looking at the transcript seemed to think that nicht meant it was better than satisfactory. And so then he got credit for math, so he didn't have to take math. He said in the end, he got 100 credit for 112 out of 124 credits, but that he had to take English. So then made me realize that maybe the fact that Rabbi Haberman got so much credit wasn't necessarily because he had already knew so much, but because of sort of problems in translation. And maybe, like a lot of the German students, they thought, oh, well, we know so much, we're going to know so much more than any of the Americans because their system of education is obviously going to be inferior. And this suggests maybe it was. And then they all actually majored in German, including Rabbi Haberman, so that should have been easy. But then, Wally Kelter says that I got a B- in German, and actually I deserved it because they said that actually the German teacher who went to Yale, I went to Yale, so I can put it down, was really not very good, and that he actually he said I made up a fake critic and I cited him in his comments on literature, and then I made up these quotes in Faust 2, the second volume, because nobody ever reads that, so I just made up quotes and I made up a critic, and so maybe I just, and the professor was none the wiser, but maybe I did deserve a B-. So anyway, we might question their secular education over there. So that was one thing that was happening. What else? Going back to Rabbi Plaut writes about, or maybe it was Kelter, sort of writes about meeting the folks at HUC, including the president, Julian Morgenstern. And so they had actually gone over to see the gymnasium, and on the first floor here, up until, I don't know, 15 years ago, no, 20 something years ago, there was a pool on the first floor of this building. And it was all men there. And so it turns out they would swim in the nude. And so when they went in there, there was actually a middle-aged gentleman standing on his head about to sort of dive into the pool naked. And that turned out to be the president of the college. And so the New American says, there I was, and there was this man naked and wringing wet. He shook my hand without embarrassment. And I mention this because then he goes on to say, and this is Plaut, it was another of those cultural shocks, which was to last me for quite a while, right? How is it they do things here in America? So they get there and they arrive, as I say, on a Friday morning. And so it's Shabbat already, it's Shabbos. So on Saturday morning, they're told you're going to get picked up and someone will bring you to services. And this is a famous story if you know anything about this group of refugee students. Rabbi Haberman doesn't comment too much on his engagement in learning about Reform Judaism, but like all these others, he says he had no idea, they had no idea what Reform Judaism was. So here's another one of the shocks that they were going to encounter. So less than a week after landing in New York, they're waiting outside the dormitory to be picked up, and along comes in a really big car a young woman. It was the wife of a rabbi, and the three memoirists describe her variously as shapely, buxom, stunning, blonde. A shapely blonde, a buxom blonde, a stunning blonde. They were shocked. They'd never seen a Rebbitzin like this. They'd never been asked to, in their studies in these rabbinical institutes, to get into a car on Saturday morning. She drove them to services with the radio blaring. They came to the Rockdale Temple, a few miles from the college. The rabbi was David Phillipson, who probably looked about like this. He was in the first ordination class at Hebrew Union College in 1888, right? So he really sort of embodied that community, the Reform tradition. He was a historian of the Reform movement. He was just all of it. And Judaism was changing in lots of ways in the 1930s and 20s and 30s, which didn't make him so happy. But he was a stalwart for the old school. So the Rebbitzin, the blonde Rebbitzin, walks them up to the front of the congregation. The first thing they're surprised at is how few people there are there, that they're mostly women and older men. That's not like the German synagogues they were coming out of. Under the Nazis, Jews had really sort of turned towards each other, and Jewish institutions were full, including the synagogues, including the clubs, including the cultural societies. So it's kind of sparse. They're handed a prayer book that looks nothing like what a prayer book looks like to them. It doesn't open from the right side. It's mostly in English, which, again, they don't know English. The service is mostly in English. The only thing that was in Hebrew, according to their recollection, was the Shema and the Kaddish. And some of them notice that the rabbi, Phillipson up there, has seen them. It's odd. They come in late. It's obvious that they're there. They look different. He's having a hard time controlling himself. But they go up to him after the service to say, good Shabbos, good Shabbos. And he blows up at them. And there are some different accounts of this from them, but Plaut, Wally Coulter says, it's clear that he was like, Phillipson was close to apoplexy. According to Plaut, they were all overwhelmed just by the strangeness of the experience, the emptiness of the building. And so he said, it was difficult, but felt weird, but he said it wasn't devastating. It was just new. But then when they go up to talk to Phillipson, he glowers at them and he kind of explodes. And this is Plaut's account of what he said. And all of them didn't know English very well. So they're actually not sure what he said, but he was mad. The first thing you have to learn is manners. In our temple, we have long given up the wearing of hats. If you ever appear here again with those things on your heads, I will have you physically removed. So this is their first Jewish service in America. And it's not much of a welcome, but it tells them they come to, it's a strange place in a strange world. It's interesting. Plaut says it's hard to understand what he was thinking, but he was sort of thinking that he was sort of overcome by hearing also these people representing change. In another week, after that, it was the first high holiday services. So Rosh Hashanah. So Wally Kelter writes about going to this building on the right, the Plum Street Temple, which is downtown in Cincinnati, still there, still part of Wise Temple. And it was actually the temple that Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism, it was built under his leadership. And so Kelter, after this experience with Phillipson, now goes to Plum Street Temple. And he just said, I found it, the music was totally goyish. There was not one familiar tune. I couldn't even detect a high holy day melody. Except for the Shema and the Kaddish, the rest of the service was conducted in English. There was a lengthy sermon by the Rabbi James Heller, which he totally couldn't understand any of. The other thing that struck him was the dress of the participants. He said, of course, in Berlin, people dressed up for the holidays, but he was put off by the party-like dress of the women. He said it was a little too showy, too extravagant. As a matter of fact, I felt so totally alienated by the whole experience that I left the service in tears and vowed never to return or to participate in such a service. The following day, he went to attend services at a conservative synagogue there, conservative Orthodox, and he felt finally at home. So it's a strange introduction, right, to American Judaism, to American Reform Judaism that they're now expected to become leaders of. When they got there, they were the only ones in the dormitory because the rest of the students were off somewhere. When Rabbi Haberman arrives in September 1938, 3 years later, the only people who are in the dorm are those 5 students and 2 other sort of German-speaking students who had also arrived a bit later. Everybody else had a home in America. They didn't have a home in America. And they encountered people like David Phillipson, who was sort of saying, yeah, you better adjust to this very quickly. And there was tension, as the new students come in. There were some who were very friendly and welcoming. But there was also something about the ways in which they went about being Jewish that was alienating to the other students. So clearly, they had gone to Phillipson's service. They had talked to the president of HUC about this, that they intended to wear their hats. That's what they did in Germany when they went to services, but in the Reform institutions in Cincinnati, they did not cover that. People like Phillipson and his congregants did not cover their heads. Many of them, they continued to wear heads, and by the time they graduated, only one was still doing that. They went to the dining room, they had a meal, they sang the grace after the Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, which had never been done, or if it had been done, it was in a long time in that dining room. And that was something that was also very alienating. And people got up and walked out. But interestingly, that then became the custom in the dining room. So there's this interesting way in which the presence of these people with a higher level of observance had an impact on the rest of the community. And that's also true. Abraham Joshua Heschel was there, and he really, adjusted his observance. He did a lot of praying by himself because he didn't want to do everything with all sort of the all the different service. He prayed 3 times a day. He wore tefillin. He wore a prayer shawl. He didn't always do that in the public spaces. But so by the time that Rabbi Haberman got there, things had changed a little bit because there were those students there. There were 7 other people in the dorm, 5 of whom were somewhat acculturated and accommodated to America, could show them the way. His experience of the school was that he made a lot of good friends there. He was shocked by it in the same ways, I think, that these folks were. But there's this sort of, this is an article about that group, that initial group 1 year later, and it talks about how well they were adjusting to the new world, right? Wolfgang Kelter is leading with music. Günter Plaut is taking leadership in a lot of things and playing tennis and working with the youth. Others are doing music. In fact, there was this interesting thing, this group, there were 5 of them. 3 of them could sing. 1 could not sing at all, and 1 could sing badly. So they formed a quartet of the 3 who could sing, the 1 who could fill badly. And they would go around, and they were the German student choir. And they would get paid for it. That was a way in which they made some money, but also they were kind of a presence. And it's interesting which communities they were a presence in, because this group, was straddling the different communities in Cincinnati. There were the Reform population and their synagogues and institutions. And there are a few institutions that sort of where German Jews kind of served Russian Jews, and then there were Orthodox and more Russian Jewish institutions. And the choir where they mainly sang was in another neighborhood in Cincinnati, considered the poor Jewish neighborhood, and they would go and sing there regularly on their Shabbat services. So, and another level of coming to America was, what did they encounter? What did Rabbi Haberman encounter when he came to America? So this is shortly after he arrives. This is January 1939. So at the one thing, you're still this is a Cincinnati Jewish newspaper, still following the terrible things that are happening and evolving. Now the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, continuing war is approaching. So there's bad news from Germany, but also here, interestingly, there's bad news in America. Father Coughlin, who some of you will have heard of, was the most popular. He was sort of I don't know, Rush Limbaugh of his day, most popular sort of. He wasn't all right wing. He actually had some left wing sort of like Social Security ideas, but he was extremely anti-Semitic, and he was one of the most popular radio programs in the country. So you had German and European anti-Semitism, but also a worry about what American anti-Semitism. On the other hand, you had other things. You had one of the Supreme Court justices was appointed in 1939, Felix Frankfurter, someone who was Jewish. And this was an interesting piece. Again, this is about the same time in the Cincinnati Enquirer. We talked about Cincinnati as a particular place where Jews had created these institutions. You saw the buildings like Rockdale and Plum Street, right? This was a very solid community. They had established many important national Jewish institutions. But not only that, Jews had been fundamental to reforming the city. In the 1920s, there had been Cincinnati was known as the worst governed city in America. Over the course of 3 years, there was a reform movement led by Murray Seasongood, a Jewish lawyer from the German Jewish community, who became mayor in 1925. And it went from being called in 1922 the worst governed city in America to being called the best governed city in America. And it wasn't just Murray Seasongood, but all people from this community who led the Department of Parks, Department of Recreation, school board, who were county commissioners. So much of the leadership of this reform movement in a city that cared about itself was Jewish. And this is a editorial welcoming, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations to Cincinnati, their meeting, recognizing that there's a lot going on in the world that's bad for Jews, but that Cincinnati has always stood for inclusion for all its groups, and particularly Jews. Like the special contributions of Jews as Jews in Cincinnati is part of what makes Cincinnati what it was, right? So that's, again, a different experience, right, than walking around Vienna and hearing what people had to say, to see, the main editorial in the central newspaper saying, we're grateful and welcome. And, reflections on, and this is something we're reflecting on now, is there something different about America from these places from which these students had come, from which Rabbi Haberman had come, right? If we sustain democracy, anti-Semitism will never come. They're thinking about what it is to be, in this world where the world is coming down on Jews elsewhere. It shouldn't happen here if we're true to America. Oscar Haberman, he hadn't yet changed his name to Joshua, begins to show up in Cincinnati and some of the organizational life there. And again, I think what we're watching is that process of Americanization, right? It's interesting to see, in this case, this is that very same convention that's being mentioned here, this UAHC convention, and we see that Oscar Haberman, right, is part of organizing the luncheons for a special organization, gathering that's going to happen to create what? A national Federation of Youth, right? And this is the origin of the National Federation of Temple Youth. So Oscar Haberman was in the room where it happened, creating NIFTY. So that's part of the reform movement. In this next one from 1941, this is at Bureau of Jewish Education, and this is a place where in Cincinnati, German Jews tried to work with German Jews to elevate Jewish education throughout the city, to support educational initiatives, including the Talmud Torah. Here, again, it's right here, Oscar Haberman, now spelled with a C instead of a K, right? So from December to April, December 38 to April 41, he adopted that. And they wrote a modern Haggadah to be performed as a play at the Bureau of Jewish Education. And then if we go down to June 5th, 1941, Rabbi Haberman was a Zionist in Vienna. He was involved with, the Zionist organization here in Cincinnati, and there he shows up as secretary for the folks organizing this. So that's June 1941. And then I think it's interesting just to see in the next school year, November 1941, where HEC names the students who are coming back to be studying there. And here you see Joshua O. Haberman, right? Deciding, there's a couple of interesting things about this. Changes his name. That's the Yeshua, which was part of his name, that was a Jewish part of his name. Oscar was trying to be German, no longer wants to do that. Changes that to an O. And then notice it says he comes from Newark, New Jersey. The other Germans in this are Ernst Lorge. It says he comes from Cincinnati. And Thomas Wiener here says he comes from Cincinnati. By this time, Haberman's parents had gotten out of Austria. They were in New York, Newark, trying to make their way. So now Joshua Haberman, who never lived in Newark, right, is from Newark. Let's see. And then I included this one. Oh, I'm going to skip to the next just because I want to wrap this up for us so we can have some questions. Someone mentioned before we got this, a lot of the important work that Rabbi Haberman did while in Cincinnati. He had the important work of finding a wife. And those of you who knew him know also about his his marriage of 70 plus years to Maxine Rubin. And here you see he's working at the Bureau of Jewish Education, putting together programs, again, 1942, a Haggadah, and working with, by the way, this committee consists of Joshua Haberman, who is the chairman, Mrs. Emmanuel Gamaran. Emmanuel Gamaran was the head of education for the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And his wife was also very educated. She had studied with Mordecai Kaplan at the Jewish Theological Seminary. So she was a real educator. Stanley Harris, I'm not sure. And then Ernst Lorge is another one of the Germans there. So again, sort of getting into really working with sort of top educational community in Cincinnati. And then he was also involved at Isaac M. Wise Temple. That was the Plum Street Temple that we saw. If you look at the youth group and their officers, right, the president is Ruth Rudin. And the recording secretary is Joshua Haberman. Now, this is very important, right? Because who is Ruth Rudin? She is the older sister of Maxine Rudin. So this tells us how he made his way in Cincinnati into all of these groups, into all of this activity. Becoming part of the HEC student community, becoming part of the broader Cincinnati Jewish community through its many organizations, having gone from someone who knows no English, right, to someone who's writing plays in English, to someone who's sort of forming connections, lifelong connections with the community there. His time in Cincinnati didn't last as long as he thought it was going to because of World War II. Many of the American Reform rabbis who served in congregations went off to serve as chaplains. And suddenly, there was just this group of 8 students from Germany and Austria, because by a year later, Rabbi Haberman points out, HUC was not going to be accepting any further students from those areas, even though there are many people who needed to get out because they didn't think that they could find jobs for the ones that they had. But because you had all this movement and people becoming chaplains, suddenly there are a lot more jobs. So he ends up going, as you may know, his first pulpit, before he was even ordained a rabbi, was in Mobile, Alabama. Is that right? Yeah. He gets married a little earlier than he thought. He leaves a little bit earlier than he thought, and that's the end of his sort of Cincinnati career. But just to say that this really then was a place where not just he, but all of this group like found their way into this very alien, strange Judaism, this strange community, sort of figured out their really their class position, figured out their kind of Judaism that they were going to bring forward. One was that was not quite what their teachers would have intended, what their classmates were bringing forward. And, as I say, like Rabbi Haberman, all of these folks went on to have a very big impact on American Judaism and on Reform Judaism. And so I'd like to say Cincinnati, was this very significant moment in the shaping of a rabbi. And I'd love to hear questions that people have. I think that if you want to share in the question and answers, you can do that. I'm seeing there is one thing here. I think everyone can see these. Lori about Dr. Glick was that in the day, students would be invited to for tea, maybe summoned would be a better word. The rabbinical students would have to balance their tea and cake on their laps and eat with a fork, so Dr. Glick could determine who would be the most successful in polite Reformed Jewish society. So all of these memoirists write, were the women in the picture? Yes, I don't know. That's a good question. I was trying to get information about who was in that picture that we showed before. But I wasn't able to do it in the time frame that we had. But what I wanted to say was they all write about, this was a big thing about, I said they figured out their class position. So before Glick, they were invited to Julian Morgenstern, the president's house, and to other members of the German Jewish community. And there was a lot that they had to figure out about cutlery, about when to speak, when not to speak, but it was very definitely seen as a test and a challenge of the kinds of expectations of how rabbis were supposed to behave. Why didn't these young men serve in the army? I think some of them did ultimately, but they were not, they were in school, so learning how to be religious leaders. And so I think some of them did go into the chaplaincy after they graduated. Why is HUC leaving Cincinnati? It's such a good question. It's a very long story, right? And it goes back to this time and it goes back to the before time. We started this session with a comment about, you wouldn't think Cincinnati was very important in American Jewish history, but of course he was extreme because that's what people who grew up, like many of us did, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, looking at a city of Cincinnati, which does not have a very big Jewish community. And the first question is, well, why is there a rabbinical seminary there? In the mid-19th century, when it was an idea in the head of Isaac Mayer Wise, Cincinnati was a very important city. It was the opening city to the West. It had one of the largest populations off the East Coast. It was a business center. It was a center of ideas. It was a right place to have it. It had, unlike New York, a leader and a community that was willing to invest in it, right? Isaac Mayer Wise was a leader, but a leader without followers is no good. This was a prosperous community, especially after the Civil War, where in Cincinnati it had been a center for ready-made clothing industry, which was this growing industry. In the Civil War, suddenly, what did you need? Uniforms, millions of uniforms. You need a lot of ready-made clothes. So there was a lot of prosperity, and they were willing to invest it in an American Jewish future and the idea there should be American rabbis. So the first question is, why was it there? And then why is it leaving? I think because that question that was started, you wouldn't think much would have happened in Cincinnati, is the way that a lot of folks have thought about it. These schools, Cincinnati, after World War II, it merged with Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, which had been founded by Stephen Wise, not related to Isaac Mayer Wise. It was founded in the 1920s. And when Stephen Wise left, there wasn't much of a future for it. Cincinnati wanted to fold it basically into Cincinnati, make it a feeder school. But the people in New York said, oh, no, 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 you can't do that. It needs to be equal. Then they were like, oh, stuff is happening on the West Coast. We better have a presence there. We'll have a little feeder school in Los Angeles, so we'll have a presence. And then the people in Los Angeles says, well, why we want to be equal? Let's have a big school. So now you have leaders in Los Angeles and New York saying, why do we need this school in Cincinnati? We have a shrinking student body. We have 3 campuses in the United States, another in Jerusalem. This can't make sense. Doesn't look good. If you wanted to make a decision that was based on actually financial need, you would probably keep it in Cincinnati and sell the properties in New York and Los Angeles, and then you'd probably be doing pretty well. But that's not what the calculation is. So it's an interesting question. You can ask more about it. What kind of discrimination the European rabbinic students face here? It seems to me that most of the discrimination that they faced was when they got to Cincinnati, right? You don't see them saying very much afterwards. Like they seem to be accepted. They're ready to go. Even Rabbi Plout says when he got to Chicago, he no longer in Cincinnati. They had started a group for new immigrants, German refugees from Germany and Austria, German speaking. Because those folks needed community and they felt like these people around us don't understand us. He said, but then we went to Chicago, it was just hanging out with Americans. Like that was the community. So there was a way in which they acculturated. They sort of were resilient and figured out how to navigate this. I think didn't face too much discrimination once they got out of here. Have you heard of the Treif model Seder? Yes. And I'm trying to remember, someone did mention it. Which is different than the Treif banquet, but I'm sorry, I'm not pulling it up right now. But I was like, oh, that was fascinating to have like another Treif dinner. I'll say one of them writes about being invited by Mrs. J. Walter Freiberg, who was a very big, influential woman, huge donor. She was a president for many years of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. He was invited to her house for Thanksgiving, and they brought out this big animal on a tray. And having had that bacon and eggs experience, he was like, could that be a pig? And then he knew nothing about Thanksgiving, and then eventually realized it was bird and learned that it was a turkey. So, they were very sensitive and they had lots of experiences where what was fed to them was not the things that they were expecting or ready for. Haberman and classmates. Yes, meaning were they at the school at the same time? So when Haberman arrives, Plout is still there, but then he graduates sooner. Also, he's sort of so I think they might be there 2 years together. The experience with the bacon and eggs is in the earlier group, the 5. So that was Plout and his colleagues, and Haberman didn't have that experience later. Again, like presumably the school learned a little bit more how to welcome these folks, and that their understanding of Judaism was a little bit different, and you didn't want to serve them bacon on the first outing. How did Rabbi Haberman end up Washington Hebrew congregation? So that's not related to the Cincinnati story, but if you read his book, it's really interesting how he thinks about the different steps that he takes. He goes when he graduates, he decides he doesn't want to stay in the South because he feels the racial hierarchy and racism there, the Jim Crow South. He doesn't want to be there. He's heading toward, I think, McKeesport, Pennsylvania, where he's going to have a solo population in a small place. On the way there, he passes through Buffalo, and the rabbi in Buffalo, and he visits the rabbi in this Reform synagogue there, and the Reform synagogue, and that rabbi says, "Don't go to McKeesport. It's a dying community. You'll learn nothing. Come back and work with me, and I'll teach you how to be a rabbi." He goes to McKeesport. He sees he's right. He goes back to Buffalo. He's there for 5 years, learns a lot in that position, then goes to Trenton, New Jersey, where he's a rabbi for I'm not sure how many years before he comes to Washington Hebrew in 1969, I think. I think that was just, a great opportunity to be at such a historic and central synagogue. And again, that's an exciting thing, that these folks who knew nothing about this American Judaism become these prominent leaders in it. The one who hated that high holiday service, he says, and it's, irony, I got to come back and give the ordination sermon in that same temple. Rabbi Herman Schulman, yes, he was. He came in 1935 in that first group. And he became a leader, I believe, in the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and lived a long time. How many Jews living in Cincinnati in 1937? How many were there now? Very good question. So Cincinnati was about at the height of its Jewish population, which is about 25,000 in 1937. So small by some measures, but big enough. And it's a little bit bigger now. It's about the same. It never really got the thing that defines Cincinnati versus other Midwestern cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, is it never really got this large East European Jewish population. It let those German Jews stay in control, but it meant it was going to be not as important a city, and it wasn't going to be as vibrant a Jewish community. So they're very big. Yes, Rabbi Phillipson represented classical reform, very much so. He, in fact, was like the avatar. He was a champion of classical reform. What was classical reform? I know Washington Hebrew was a classical reform congregation. But really it was at its height in Cincinnati, and at this period, which meant that it was those services like you heard, right? There was mostly English. It was very formal. The rabbi talked a lot and was very important. There was not a lot of informality. So one of the things they didn't do was carry the Torah around on Smichas Torah, or dance with it, or they didn't do a lot of the moving, the bowing that we now see in a lot of Reformed congregations, that part of the worship service. They certainly Phillipson was a leader of anti-Zionism in American Judaism, saying that being Jewish should not be a national identity, it's a religious identity. And so having a country that's based around Jewish identity makes no sense, right? The right identity is to be an American, or wherever you are, be a Jew in that place. World War II was very crushing, the whole experience that was happening as these students came in, and he knew it was where they were. That's why Platt says, I can't understand why he behaved that way, because he knew where they were coming from. But one of the things that they experienced as discrimination or lack of understanding was kind of a lack of attention, like acting as if what was going on in their families and their homes and their psyches wasn't, like not seeming to take seriously what all of those students were going through. Students did remain in the reform movement, and they remained, and then, as I said, they became important leaders in it. They were very much a part of moving American Reform Judaism away from that classical Judaism, right? Because they didn't have a stake in having something that was so stripped down of the things that you did to be Jewish, the language, and the practices. What was Elizabeth Haberman's greatest contribution? Now, I wish you were all here. I would leave that to others in this group to say. Seems to me he was a wonderful leader and role model and had big impact on those in his congregation. But I'll leave that for others here because I know folks who knew him can talk about that. But it was very important to let's see about that. And it may be this institute, like the different things, like focusing on like adult education and other things are part. And of course, being at the center of in the nation's capital is also something that sort of elevates a community and including the members of the congregation. Yes, why don't we say something about matzah? Art mentioned it was the invention of square matzah in Cincinnati, which is true. So the Manischewitz family, Burl Manischewitz, Burl, that was one of the sons. There was a man, Mr. Manischewitz, and he had a number of sons. And they really built up this a mechanized process for making matzah, created a national industry and distribution from Cincinnati. One of the interesting things, there are things about like that question, why is it leaving? Why is HEC leaving Cincinnati? There's been a series of things that have left Cincinnati, right? It was this very central place where very important things got created. The first long-lasting institutions of American Judaism, that is the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and Hebrew Union College, the first successful long-lasting rabbinical school, and also matzah, square matzah, right? And in the 1920s, the Manischewitz family decides to move their central factory to Jersey City, right? And the Manischewitz brothers, and they're all very observant, very Orthodox, moved to like Central Park West and things like that. So that was, and like one representative remained, and they still supported things in Cincinnati. But it was another kind of, also there was an Orthodox stronghold, kind of model on the Reform stronghold a little bit, like Orthodox leaders in the sense that Cincinnati should be an important center for American Judaism, and that's sort of fallen away little by little, and the matzah leaving was one aspect of that. Did the German rabbis drop kashrut? Yes. So there's a little bit of some of them write about that, where one of them writes about how he only ate in the dorm dining room things that were only vegetarian, but then he got sick and they said you need to eat meat, and so then he dropped it for that. And I have a feeling that a number of them adjusted their practice. Obviously, Abraham Joshua Heschel did not drop his practice. So Rabbi Perlin says something very important. We shorthanded that the rabbinical school was being closed down in Cincinnati. We learned recently that the graduate school that has been there has been important as a place for both non-Jews and Jewish students to study Jewish tradition and culture and history. They're closing that down. But there's still these very important institutions that are in Cincinnati. There's the Clow Library, which is a library that is sort of beyond belief. And there are a lot of people who fear what would happen if that doesn't stay there. There's no room for it at the other institutions of HEC institutions. American Jewish Archives, which was created by Jacob Marcus, who was a teacher of all of these people, and one of the ones they liked, including Rabbi Haberman. In fact, they all worked for him. One of the job that they had, Jacob Marcus, he was a very smart guy. He put them to work on German Jewish newspapers, German Jewish records. One of them was working in Yiddish records. Someone was working in Russian records. So this was a time really before Marcus instituted the American Jewish Archives, but in a way he was getting ready. He was gathering material. And of course, he hired all of these student rabbis and took advantage of their language skills that a lot of the American students didn't have. For now, there will be no rabbinical school. Well, Rabbi Perlin's hope that something will come back there because, you know, as you might hear from me, I mean, it was this strange, I wouldn't say like you know, the fact that, you know, these folks got dropped into this environment that was so foreign to, even though it was Jewish, was so very foreign to them, you know, says something about what American Reform Judaism was at that moment. It's evolved quite a bit, but that whole history of what has taken, you know, what has gone into creating American Judaism is in that place, those institutions, you know, sort of the buildings, the built structures, many of them are in that place. So there's a sense there. Last year, I took my students from the Jewish Communal Leadership Program here at the University of Michigan. We do a thing where we go to another community, and actually just last week was with them in Pittsburgh, which was amazing. But last year we went to Cincinnati. In Pittsburgh, there's a thing you can touch right now, which is sort of the layers of resilience and, you know, navigating sort of the crises of our time and the pain of our time. In Cincinnati, I loved having I love being in Cincinnati, but I love bringing my students to Cincinnati because you can just touch, you can just feel the history. It's right there. You can't not see it. You can't believe that, you know, what is just what I see in front of me, which I think is one of the problems of our time. All I need to know is what I see on my computer screen, right? Whatever that is. When you're living in the presence of that library, of that archives, of those institutions, and you think about what it took to build them, to say we need there to be an American Judaism. I don't think you recreate that anywhere else but right there. So hopefully, Rabbi, it will not just be for now. Where in kippah was still an issue at your bar mitzvah in 1971. Yeah, so 71. Cincinnati, I think Judaism is still in tension, and as probably in many cities, I don't know about at Washington Hebrew, for instance, you know, between sort of these older traditions and newer traditions, and people have a lot at stake in them. So the 70s, in places where classical reform ruled, it definitely ruled. It was changed not just by people like these German rabbis, but by the fact that a lot of people coming into Reform congregations came from a Russian Jewish background. And there are things that they thought should be Jewish that they thought should be there. And so that kind of helped push change. I mean, one example of classical Reform Judaism, you know, one of the things David Phillipson hated more than anything was bar mitzvahs. He hated bar mitzvahs. He thought it was like a savage coming of age rite practice. 13-year-old boys, why are you doing that? That was part of classical reform, right? Confirmation. But I'd say you're not going to find many Reform congregations where they don't have bar mitzvahs, unless they have no kids there, and then they're sad. Sunday Sabbaths was part of some classical reform. There was a classical reform there were Sunday Sabbath observances, Sunday services at Rockdale Temple with Phillipson, though he didn't think that was really the best way for them to be. Those two have mostly gone out of fashion. You could be classical reform and Zionist. So the other congregation in Cincinnati, that Plum Street Temple, they had another building, Y Center. And someone that Phillipson hated, James Heller, was quite a Zionist, right? And even though a lot of the members of the congregation were not Zionist, he was. And there were a lot of Zionists in Cincinnati. So you could be classical reform and be a Zionist leader. Cleveland also, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver was one of the leading Zionists in the nation, and he led a classical reform congregation. And so you know, if you were a Reform Jew in Cincinnati, you'd be more likely to belong to Y Center than Rockdale. because the rabbi would be sympathetic. But there were definitely people who were also not Zionists in those congregations. Rabbi Eliezer Silver is just dropped there. He was, maybe you put it in when I was saying that there was a strong Orthodox center in Cincinnati. Eliezer Silver saw himself as the chief Orthodox rabbi of America, and he was very influential. He fought with David Phillipson about whether there should be a mikveh in their neighborhood. Albert Goldman, another stalwart classical reform. Albert Goldman in Cincinnati was also very active in civil rights movement. Samuel Hall. This is Michael. You and I should have a conversation about Cincinnati Jewry and these rabbis and what they represented, because they all represent something a little bit different. I thought Reform Judaism started in Germany. Therefore, I'm surprised the five fellows did not know about it. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing. But one thing to understand is that Reform Judaism in Germany was much different than Reform Judaism in America. So these things that they encountered, like bacon and eggs, expectation that at a Reformed seminary that you would drive, that would not be something that would happen in Germany. It was still more traditional because the overall community was more traditional, if that makes sense. So it's a really good question. So even they would say, oh, it's liberal Judaism, men and women are sitting together. We recognize that, but it was still much more sort of radical change than what they saw in Germany. They all were kippahs, right, on the bima, right? That tradition has changed. Wow. This is a great thing. Like if you want to wear a kippah, if you want to have a bar mitzvah, why do you have to be here? Like go to the places where they do that. If you want to dance around with a Torah, that is a classical reform response, right? We built these institutions to be a certain thing. The issue we have is that American Jews collectively have changed. And so it's sort of a market thing, right? If you want to sort of say, well, we forbid, like Phillipson did, kippot, yarmulkes, we forbid, we're not going to do these things. Then while initially that was done to try and attract young members, now it might be seen as a thing that's going to push people away, right? It's too cold, it's too formal. One of the things that Rabbi Haberman comments about is about his experience in Cincinnati and at HEC is that they never taught him faith, right? They didn't teach him to think about God and the meaning of that. And that was something that he wanted to do. Anyway, that's something interesting. Right, that was another thing. And that was thought that classical reform was thought to be very cold and formal, right? And that some of the other practices are warmer, right? Are more community minded. Okay. The conservative one was bareheaded. Well, who knows? You have to ask that person why they did that. So there was a question in the chat about that question about that they stayed in the reform movement because it seemed like some of these experiences were so alienating. It's an interesting question. Sorry, I'm just looking to see if I'm missing something here. This was a mixed experience that they had, right? What they write about how alienating it was at the outset. I think, one of the things that they were saying was that soon after these folks graduated, they did a survey and they found out that nobody much liked the education there. But I think that the Reform synagogue system worked at that time, right? They did learn things and they found that, they also complained that they didn't learn too much about how to be a rabbi, but they also had student pulpits, where they kind of learned these things and they went into those spaces. So, just make sure I'm getting it. So I think that they grew into the system. They grew into America. They grew into sort of understanding Reform Judaism. They got to know the people there. It's a very sort of, as Rabbi Perlin will tell you, it's a very sort of inward-looking system. Once you're sort of part of it, you're part of it. And many of them became leaders, presidents of the CCAR, sort of honored statesmen and representatives, much like Rabbi Haberman, right? And beloved. And you might think about those of you who knew him or knew some of these other folks, what they brought, right? From they certainly had a life experience that was different than the sort of American-born rabbis that they were trained with. Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Goldman, for the presentation and tackling all of these great questions. Just with a couple minutes left, I was wondering if there were any final thoughts that you wanted to leave us with.
Well, thank you. It was really interesting as thinking about Rabbi Haberman to sort of dig into the experience and think about the experience of all of these rabbis, because in his book, Haberman shows just a little bit, like a little tinge of this. And, I think I like the way Art framed it at the beginning, there was something about going through the prism of this particular community. That certainly shaped their Judaism in a way that made them both sort of insiders and outsiders at the same time. And I think it's gonna just encourage me to think more about kind of this moment in their experience. And I hope it helps you understand, those of you who knew Rabbi Haberman, understand him a little bit more. And just as one part, I did notice in the things that are posted online, like there's just that one comment about Vienna, right? And it seemed to me he didn't reflect too much back on that time and where he came out of, but we know that it was very much part of what he brought to his life wisdom, which he shared often, and his leadership.
Yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate this talk. I myself never had the opportunity to meet Rabbi Haberman, so learning about his life and experience has been really wonderful, and I appreciate that. And also I want to note for those of you, the archives, the Jewish archives, have now included part of Rabbi Haberman's materials online, and it's now live. So you can actually read I looked at it the other day. You can read some of his sermons going back to when he was in school, even, or at least into the 40s. So you can, we'll send you that link in our follow-up materials if you're interested in exploring any of that.
Looks like they also have a number of interviews with him.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can access that except there, but there's a lot of material, which is great.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful resource. So thank you again, and thank you all out there for joining us, and we'll send a follow-up in the next couple of days. So have a great rest of your day.